In 1817, a governor of New York broke ground on a waterway that the President of the United States had called little short of madness. The state betting on it had no formally trained civil engineer on its payroll. No canal of this size had ever been attempted in America, and the federal government had already refused to pay for a single mile of it. Before it reached its halfway point, more than 1,000 laborers would fall to a fever with no understood cause in a swamp that barely appeared on any accurate map of the era. A masonry crisis with no known solution anywhere in the United States would be resolved almost by accident, in a quarry examined as an afterthought, by two contractors who nearly threw the discovery away as a ruined batch of lime. Along a cliff line in the western part of the state, workers would blast and carve a staircase of stone locks rising 60 feet in under 2 miles without a single formally trained civil engineer supervising the work, because none existed yet in the country. The canal had to climb 568 feet from the Hudson River to Lake Erie, using tools that amounted to little more than shovels, picks, and horse-drawn scrapers on a workforce paid by the amount of earth they could move in a day. 8 years after it began, a governor would carry 2 casks of lake water 363 miles to pour them into an ocean in a ceremony official records would call a marriage of the waters. The cost of shipping a ton of freight from Buffalo to New York would drop from roughly $100 to $10 almost overnight, and a 3-week overland journey would become an 8-day trip by water. Within 15 years, a shipping outpost of a few thousand people on the shore of Lake Erie would become a city of tens of thousands, and New York City would outgrow every other American port combined. 200 years later, the reason New York remains the financial center of the United States can still be traced back, in a direct and documented line, to 8 years of digging that almost never happened. This is Quiet History at Bedtime. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this account comes from government archives, legislative records, and current academic research on the period. Just relax and let this play as you drift into sleep. Now, let us begin. In the first decade of the 1800s, the United States was a nation split in two by geography, and almost nobody in power had a plan for fixing it. East of the Appalachian Mountains sat the coastline: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, cities built on trade with Europe and with each other, connected by water that ships could actually use. West of the mountains lay a different country in every practical sense: Ohio, the territories that would become Indiana and Illinois, and the vast agricultural potential of the Great Lakes Basin were cut off from the eastern seaboard by a mountain range with no navigable river crossing it. A farmer in central New York or western Pennsylvania who grew more wheat than his family could eat had almost no way to sell the surplus in an eastern city. The land route was the only route, and the land route was not a road in any modern sense. It was a rutted, mud-choked track that a wagon could travel at perhaps 2 miles an hour in good weather, and not at all in bad weather. Moving a single ton of goods overland from Buffalo to New York City cost roughly $100 and took close to 3 weeks. For comparison, the same ton could cross the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Liverpool for a fraction of that price. The ocean was cheaper than the mountains. This was not an abstract inconvenience. It was the reason that Western farmers sometimes burned surplus grain rather than pay to transport it, and the reason that entire regions of fertile land sat undersettled, not because the soil was poor, but because there was no economical way to get a harvest to a market that would pay for it. Rivers offered a partial answer, but only a partial one. The Mohawk River cut through central New York and could carry small boats part of the way west, and the Great Lakes themselves formed an enormous inland water system. But the two networks did not connect to each other. Water travel stopped at a specific point in the landscape with no natural passage forward, and everything beyond that point had to move by wagon, on foot, or not at all. Europe had already demonstrated that an artificial canal could solve exactly this kind of problem. Britain's canal network, built across the second half of the 1700s, had turned isolated industrial regions into connected markets, and had done so at a fraction of the cost of road transport. American observers who had traveled abroad understood the principle well enough. What the United States lacked was not the concept, but the capital, the political will, and, as would soon become clear, a workforce with any experience building one. Several port cities on the coast understood that whoever solved this problem first would control the trade of the entire American interior. Philadelphia and Baltimore both had geographic advantages that New York lacked: shorter, more direct paths toward the Ohio Valley, without a mountain range as tall standing in the way. New York's route westward, by contrast, ran through wilderness, swampland, and a limestone escarpment near Lake Erie that dropped 60 feet in under 2 miles. On paper, New York should have lost this competition. It won it because of one specific advantage the other cities did not have: a natural low-elevation gap in the Appalachian chain, running roughly along the Mohawk River Valley, that no other coastal state could match. The mountains that blocked Pennsylvania and Maryland from an easy western route did not block New York in quite the same way. Pennsylvania and Maryland were not standing still while New York debated. Both states poured money into turnpike roads and, later, into their own canal proposals aimed at the same western trade, the Potomac Company's efforts toward the Ohio Valley among them. None of these projects found a path through the mountains as direct as the one New York had, and none of them would be completed on a comparable scale before New York's canal was already moving freight. The idea of a canal exploiting that gap did not begin with a politician. It began with a bankrupt flour merchant. Jesse Hawley ran a flour business in western New York in the early 1800s, and like most merchants in the region, he could not move his product to market at a price that made the business viable. The company failed, and Hawley was sent to debtor's prison, a routine outcome for failed businessmen at the time, and not, on its own, a remarkable event. What made it consequential was what Hawley did while he was there. Between 1807 and 1808, from inside a prison cell, he wrote a series of 14 essays laying out in specific and technical detail a proposed route for a canal connecting Lake Erie to the Hudson River. He published them in a local newspaper, the Genesee Messenger, under a pen name. Hawley was not an engineer, and he had no formal training in surveying or hydraulics. What he had was a direct financial stake in the problem, a shelf of geography books borrowed from acquaintances, and enough uninterrupted time in a cell to work through the terrain, mile by mile. His essays were specific in a way that surprised readers who expected vague enthusiasm instead of an engineering argument. He proposed a route along the Mohawk Valley and across the flatter land south of Lake Ontario, estimated the elevation the canal would need to climb, and argued for a series of locks to manage that change in height, details that later surveys would confirm as broadly workable. He signed the essays Hercules, a pen name that made no secret of the scale he had in mind. The essays circulated among New York's political class through 1807 and 1808 and became one of the first serious public arguments that the canal was not just possible, but necessary, written, notably, by a man who had never been trained to make that argument and had every reason, sitting in a debtor's cell, to resent the transportation system that had put him there. The idea reached the state legislature the following year, through a different figure entirely. In 1808, a New York assemblyman named Joshua Foreman proposed a modest expenditure, $600, to fund a formal survey of a possible canal route across the state. The legislature approved it. It was a small decision, and it did not commit the state to anything beyond gathering information. But it was the first time the idea moved from newspaper argument to official state business. 2 more years passed before the next step. In 1810, the legislature appointed a board of commissioners to study the feasibility of inland waterway improvements more broadly. And in 1811, that board was given a specific mandate: study a continuous waterway route from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. One member of that commission would become the project's defining figure. DeWitt Clinton was a New York political veteran, a former U.S. senator, a former mayor of New York City, and by 1817, the governor of the state. And he attached himself to the canal proposal with a persistence that outlasted several changes in the state's political leadership. Clinton's advocacy was not universally welcomed, and the opposition came from inside his own state's government, not from outside it. A rival political faction centered around the Tammany Hall organization in New York City viewed Clinton's rise and his signature project with open suspicion, partly on the merits of the canal itself, and partly because a successful project would hand Clinton enormous political capital. The nickname that stuck to the canal in these early years, Clinton's Ditch, was coined by opponents and was not meant as a compliment. The scale of the proposal was, by the standards of the time, almost unprecedented. A 363-mile artificial waterway would be longer than any canal yet built in the United States, cutting through terrain that included solid rock, dense forest, and at least one swamp with a local reputation for sickness that predated any construction crew. Clinton's response to the skepticism was not to minimize the risk, but to argue that the state's economic future depended on taking it. In public writing and legislative testimony, he framed the canal as the difference between New York remaining a regional port and New York becoming the commercial center of the entire country, a claim that at the time had no evidence behind it beyond Clinton's own confidence. The federal government was not going to pay for it. In 1808, President Thomas Jefferson had been asked to support federal funding for the project, and his response, recorded in the period's correspondence, was blunt. He called the idea of building a canal 350 miles through wilderness little short of madness, and noted that such a project belonged, at best, a century in the future. Jefferson's skepticism was not unreasonable given the engineering knowledge available at the time. No canal of this length or scale had ever been attempted in North America. The country had no dedicated school of civil engineering, and the first American institutions to offer formal engineering degrees would not exist for years. There was, in a very literal sense, no one in the United States qualified on paper to design what New York was proposing to build. Without federal support, the financial burden fell entirely on New York State. This was, in its own way, a more consequential decision than the canal itself. New York's legislature chose to fund a $7 million infrastructure project, an enormous sum for a single state in this period, roughly equivalent to several years of the state's entire tax revenue through its own bonds, betting that eventual toll revenue would repay both the principal and the interest. There was no precedent in American public finance for a state issuing debt at this scale for a single construction project. If the canal failed, or took far longer than planned, or proved unable to attract enough freight traffic to cover its tolls, New York would be left holding a debt with no corresponding asset to show for it. The bondholders, many of them New York merchants, and, within a few years, a growing number of European investors, were making the same bet Clinton was making, with their own capital instead of their political reputation. The vote authorizing construction passed the state legislature in April 1817 by a margin narrow enough that a modest shift in a handful of districts could have ended the project before it began. Clinton, elected governor that same year, would be the official most closely associated with seeing it through, for better or worse depending on the outcome. Construction began on the 4th of July, 1817, at a location just outside the town of Rome, in the central part of the state. The date was almost certainly chosen for its symbolism, a public works project framed, from its first day, as an expression of national capability rather than a narrow state interest, even though the federal government had refused to pay for a single mile of it. The canal commissioners adopted a contracting system that would shape the entire project. Rather than employ a single large workforce directly, the state divided the route into short sections, often no more than a mile at a time, and contracted local landowners and farmers to dig each section to a common engineering specification: a channel 40 feet wide at the surface, 28 feet wide at the bottom, and 4 feet deep, with a towpath running alongside for the mules and horses that would pull the boats. This decentralized approach had a practical advantage. It let the state draw on local labor and local knowledge of the terrain, and it spread both the risk and the cost across hundreds of small contracts rather than one enormous undertaking. It would also, within 2 years, force a change in who was doing the digging, as the route moved into terrain that local farmers had no interest in touching. The starting point itself was a deliberate choice. Rather than begin at either end of the planned route, engineers chose to start with the middle 90-mile section, the stretch of land between Utica and the area near Syracuse, because it presented the fewest natural obstacles. No mountains, no major rock formations, no swamps requiring drainage. It was, relative to what lay ahead to the east and west, the easiest ground available. That choice reflected an honest assessment of the state's own uncertainty. The commissioners authorizing the project did not know, with any confidence, whether the harder sections further along the route, the limestone cliffs near Lake Erie, the marshland west of Syracuse, could be built at all with the tools and knowledge available in 1817. Starting with the easy 90 miles let the state test the basic method of canal construction before committing to the sections that might prove impossible. The surveys that produced the final route had taken years to complete, and they had to answer a single, non-negotiable engineering question before a single shovel could be authorized. The canal had to rise, in total, 568 feet from the level of the Hudson River to the level of Lake Erie. and it had to do so gradually enough that a horse-drawn boat could move through it without the current overwhelming the vessel or the towpath. Solving that problem required locks, chambers of stone and wood that could raise or lower a boat from one water level to the next, sealed by heavy gates at either end. The flatter sections of the route needed relatively few of them. The terrain further west, where the land dropped sharply toward Lake Erie, would need far more, clustered together in a way no one in America had yet attempted to build. The surveyors also knew, from early scouting reports, that the western half of the route carried two specific reputations among the people who already lived near it. One section, close to the lake, was known for a limestone ridge steep enough that local farmers considered it unfarmable. Another section, further east, was a marsh that local residents avoided for reasons that had nothing to do with the difficulty of the ground and everything to do with what the ground was rumored to do to the people who worked in it. Neither reputation had stopped the commissioners from including these sections in the approved route. There was no alternative path that avoided both obstacles and still reached Lake Erie, and by 1817, the state had already committed $7 million to a plan that required going through them, not around them. There was one more problem waiting beneath the surface of that decision, and it was arguably more serious than any swamp or cliff face still ahead of the route. The state of New York had just authorized the largest public infrastructure project in the young nation's history, and it had done so without a single person on its payroll who held a formal engineering credential in canal construction. This was not an oversight. It was a structural fact about the United States in 1817. The country's first dedicated schools of civil engineering, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute among them, did not yet exist. West Point trained military engineers, primarily in fortification, not in the hydraulics of moving water across 363 miles of uneven terrain. A young man who wanted to become a canal engineer in America in this period had exactly one place to learn the trade, and it was the canal itself. The men the canal commissioners chose to lead the work reflected this reality. The chief engineer, a judge and surveyor named Benjamin Wright, had spent his career measuring land boundaries, not designing locks or calculating the hydraulic pressure of moving water. His deputy on much of the route, James Geddes, had similarly built his experience surveying rather than engineering. Neither man had ever built anything resembling what they were now responsible for constructing. What they had, instead of formal training, was a habit the project would come to depend on, a willingness to treat every unsolved problem as something to be worked out on site, through trial, measurement, and correction, rather than looked up in a textbook that did not yet exist in English. Locks would be built, found inadequate, and rebuilt. Cement would fail, be tested, and be replaced. The canal would function, in its first years, less like a finished design and more like a live engineering experiment that happened to also be moving freight. That experiment was about to begin in earnest on the 90 flat, forgiving miles between Utica and the outskirts of Syracuse, the easiest ground the entire route had to offer, and the last easy ground its builders would see for a long time. A typical day on that first, easiest stretch gives some sense of what the project actually looked like on the ground, away from the legislative debates and bond negotiations that had authorized it. A contracted crew of local farmers would arrive before sunrise, work through the daylight hours with shovel and pick, break at midday for whatever food their families had sent along, and measure their progress not in miles, but in rods. a unit of roughly 16.5 feet, since that was the increment a resident engineer could realistically inspect and approve at the end of a working day. Rain turned the excavated channel to mud that had to be baled before work could resume, and a hard frost in autumn could halt digging for days at a stretch, long before winter made the harder western sections unworkable in a different, more dangerous way. None of that daily grind made for the kind of story that circulated in Albany's newspapers or the state legislature's own debates. What circulated instead were numbers: the miles completed, the dollars spent, the tolls collected, because numbers were what the bondholders and the political opposition both understood, and numbers were what would eventually settle the argument Jefferson had made in 1808, one completed mile at a time. Benjamin Wright was 44 years old when the canal commissioners named him chief engineer of the middle section, and his qualifications for the job amounted to 2 decades of experience surveying land boundaries in central New York, along with a personal interest in mathematics that went beyond what his formal schooling had covered. He had never built a lock. He had never designed a canal. What he had was a working knowledge of the terrain between Utica and Syracuse, gained from years of walking it with a surveyor's chain, and a willingness, shared by nearly everyone the commissioners hired, to treat the absence of expertise as a problem to be solved, rather than a reason to delay. Wright's deputy, James Geddes, arrived at the project with a similar background and an additional complication. He was, by trade, a salt manufacturer from the Syracuse area, whose surveying skills had been picked up informally rather than taught. Geddes had first come to the commissioner's attention years earlier, during the original 1808 survey work, when he produced route measurements accurate enough to convince skeptical legislators that a workable path across the state actually existed. Between the two of them, Wright and Geddes represented the most qualified engineering leadership available in the state of New York in 1817, and neither of them would have qualified for an entry-level engineering position in Britain, where formal canal-building education already existed and had for decades. What made the arrangement function was not credentials but consequence. Wright, in particular, would go on to train, directly or indirectly, most of the engineers who later built America's next generation of canals and railroads, simply because the Erie Canal was, for years, the only place in the country where that kind of experience could be gained at all. The men beneath Wright and Geddes, on the project's technical side, were assembled the same way. Resident engineers overseeing individual sections of the route were often local surveyors, land agents, or even school teachers with a talent for mathematics, elevated into engineering roles because the project needed more supervisors than the country had trained candidates to fill them. This gap did not go unnoticed by the commissioners, and it produced one of the more consequential decisions of the entire project. In the fall of 1817, shortly after construction began, the state sent a young surveyor named Canvas White to England with instructions to walk the length of the British canal network, study its construction methods firsthand, and bring back whatever technical knowledge the trip produced. White was 27 years old, had served briefly in the War of 1812, and had joined the canal project as a junior member of Wright's surveying team. Over several months, he covered more than 2,000 miles on foot, examining locks, aqueducts, and construction techniques across the English canal system, and taking careful notes on a building material that did not yet have a reliable American equivalent: cement that could set and harden underwater. Among the structures White examined most closely was the Pont Cysyllta Coxyd in Wales, an 1,800-foot channel of water carried more than 100 feet above a valley floor on cast-iron piers, an engineering scale far beyond anything the Erie Canal would attempt, but a demonstration of what was structurally possible when a canal needed to cross an obstacle rather than go around it. He also studied the mechanics of British lock gates, the standard dimensions English engineers had settled on for chambers of different sizes, and the surveying instruments British crews used to establish level lines across long distances with a precision the American team had not yet matched. He returned to New York in the spring of 1818 with detailed drawings, updated surveying instruments more precise than anything the American crews had been using, and a specific technical problem he now understood well enough to try solving domestically. That problem, waterproof cement, would not become urgent until the canal reached its harder western sections. In the meantime, the middle 90 miles offered a more basic and immediate education: how to actually dig a channel of consistent width and depth across 90 miles of forest and farmland, and keep it holding water once it was finished. The workforce assembled to do this work was, in its early stages, drawn almost entirely from the surrounding countryside. An 1820 report from the Canal Commission recorded that roughly 3 out of every 4 laborers on the initial sections had been born in the region, local farmers and their sons, working under the section-by-section contracting system the state had established, paid by the amount of earth they moved rather than by the day. The tools available to them were, by any later standard, primitive: shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, and horse-drawn scrapers for the more level ground. There were no steam-powered excavators, no dynamite for the rock they would eventually encounter further west. Dynamite itself would not be invented for another 5 decades, and no standardized construction machinery of any kind. Nearly every foot of the 363-mile channel would ultimately be dug by hand or by animal power, one contracted section at a time. The section-by-section contracting system that made this workforce possible had its own internal logic and its own risks. A local farmer might take on a contract to dig a quarter-mile stretch of channel near his own property, hire neighbors and seasonal laborers to do the physical work, and be paid according to the volume of earth removed and the quality of the finished section, as judged by a resident engineer's inspection. This kept costs distributed and let the state avoid managing a single enormous labor force directly. But it also meant that quality varied considerably from one short section to the next, depending entirely on the diligence of whichever local contractor had taken responsibility for it. Payment disputes were common. Contractors who underestimated how much rock or root-tangled ground lay beneath the surface of their section often found themselves losing money on a job priced by volume rather than by difficulty, and petitions to the canal commissioners requesting additional payment or contract modifications became a routine part of the project's administrative record almost from its first year. Wright himself could not personally inspect every one of the hundreds of small contracted sections spread across 90 miles, and the system that emerged to manage that gap became, in its own way, as important to the canal's success as any single engineering decision. Resident engineers, often young men with little more surveying experience than a season or 2 on the project, were assigned to specific stretches with the authority to approve or reject a contractor's finished work, and their judgment, backed by nothing more formal than Wright's trust and a rough set of written specifications, effectively decided whether a farmer got paid on schedule or was sent back to redo a section at his own expense. This informal chain of authority produced its share of friction. A contractor who believed his section met specification could find himself in a dispute with a resident engineer half his age, arguing over whether a channel's bottom was truly 28 feet wide or merely close enough, and these disagreements, multiplied across hundreds of sections, generated a steady stream of correspondence to the commissioner's office in Albany that any visitor examining the surviving records can still find preserved today. The composition of the workforce itself did not stay fixed for long. As construction moved westward, away from the settled farmland near Utica, and toward ground that local landowners had no interest in touching, contractors found it increasingly difficult to recruit nearby farmers for the work. In their place, contractors turned to a labor pool that had only recently begun arriving in large numbers at New York Harbor: Irish immigrants, willing to take on the harder, lower-status sections of the route that established local workers avoided. These workers were typically paid around $12 a month, a portion of which was often provided as whiskey rather than cash, a common labor arrangement of the period, though one that would later be blamed, fairly or not, for periodic violence and disorder in the work camps. Tension between the arriving Irish laborers and the longer settled communities along the route grew alongside this shift, rooted partly in economic competition for scarce work and partly in religious prejudice that had little to do with the canal itself. For many of these newly arrived laborers, the canal work camps were their first extended experience of the American interior at all, a landscape entirely unlike the port cities where their ships had docked. Housing was rough, typically shanties built from scrap lumber and canvas near whatever section a crew was currently working, and the camps moved westward along with the digging itself, breaking down and reassembling every few weeks as one stretch of channel was completed and the next began. A crew that had spent a month clearing forest near one small settlement might, by the following month, be living in an entirely different camp miles away, with little connection to the community it had just left behind. Two pieces of practical invention emerged from this labor almost immediately. Workers clearing forested sections of the route needed a way to remove tree stumps without the enormous time cost of digging each one out individually, and an early version of a device that came to be called a stump puller, a wheeled mechanism using a chain and lever system to uproot stumps with a fraction of the manual labor, was developed on this stretch of the route out of necessity rather than formal design. A second improvised tool addressed a different obstacle: a plow strong enough and sharp enough to cut through the root-tangled, unbroken soil of land that had never been farmed. Standard farm plows were not built for this kind of ground, and a modified, heavier plow, again, a field adaptation rather than an engineered solution, became standard equipment along the route within the first 2 years of construction. The first lock built on the canal was completed in 1817 near the town of Rome, close to the original groundbreaking site, and it served a purpose beyond simply moving a boat between two water levels. It was, in effect, the crew's first test of whether their entire theoretical approach to lock construction would hold up under real water pressure. The specification Wright and Geddes had settled on for the finished canal was consistent across its entire length, a channel 40 feet wide at the surface and 4 feet deep, capable of carrying boats loaded with roughly 30 tons of cargo, pulled along a towpath by mules or horses, walking at a slow, steady pace. Across the full route, the completed canal would eventually require 83 locks to manage its total rise of 568 feet, a number that in 1817 existed only on paper, since fewer than a handful had actually been built. It held, but the process of getting there was not smooth. A lock chamber was, at its core, a rectangular box of cut stone with heavy wooden gates at each end, built to hold back several feet of water while a boat inside rose or fell to the next level. Every joint between every stone block needed to be sealed well enough to survive constant contact with water. Repeated pressure changes as the chamber filled and emptied, and the freeze-thaw cycle of a New York winter. Early attempts at sealing these joints using ordinary lime mortar, the standard building material available domestically, proved unreliable under exactly those conditions. Ordinary lime needed to dry in open air to cure properly, and a structure designed to sit in water for its entire working life gave the mortar no opportunity to do that. Joints leaked. Water pressure found the weak seams within weeks of a lock's completion, and some early sections of masonry had to be taken apart and redone entirely, at a cost the contracting system had not planned for and the state had not budgeted. This was the exact problem Canvas White had been sent to England to study, and by 1818 his research was becoming urgent rather than theoretical. English canal builders used a specific type of limestone that, when burned and ground into powder, produced a cement capable of hardening even when constantly submerged, a material English engineers, such as John Smeaton, had rediscovered decades earlier, tracing the technique back to construction methods used by the ancient Romans. No source of this kind of stone had been confirmed anywhere in the United States. Importing British hydraulic cement across the Atlantic Ocean for a project already stretching the limits of New York State's finances was not a realistic long-term option. The cost and the shipping time would have made the middle sections of the canal prohibitively expensive to seal properly, to say nothing of the far larger quantities the western locks would eventually require. White spent the months following his return from England testing limestone samples from quarries across the canal route, searching for a domestic stone with the right mineral composition to replicate what he had studied abroad. It was, in its own way, as uncertain an experiment as the digging itself. A young surveyor with no formal chemistry training, running informal trials on rock samples, looking for a material nobody had yet proven existed in the region at all. The search was not White's alone. In 1818, two local contractors near the village of Chittenango in Madison County burned a batch of ordinary limestone for a masonry contract and found, on testing it, that the resulting lime would not slack properly. It behaved wrong, in a way that made it useless for the job they had been hired to do. Rather than discard it, the contractors brought the strange batch to the attention of the canal's engineers, including White and Wright, both of whom had reason to take a failed batch of cement seriously rather than dismiss it. A local physician with a scientific bent, brought in to examine the material, broke the stone down, burned it again under controlled conditions, ground it into powder, mixed it with sand, and shaped the result into a ball, which he then submerged in a bucket of water overnight to see what would happen. By morning, it had hardened, not despite the water, but because of it. What had first looked like a ruined batch of ordinary lime was, in fact, a naturally occurring hydraulic limestone, chemically suited to exactly the underwater application the canal's locks required. White recognized what he was looking at immediately. The Chittenango quarries, and others nearby with similar geology, contained a stone that could be burned, crushed, and mixed into a cement that hardened underwater without any need for imported British material. He patented the process in 1820, though the canal commissioners would later use it widely without fully compensating him for the discovery. By the time construction finished, more than 500,000 bushels of white cement had gone into the canal's locks, aqueducts, and culverts, a quantity that made the material essential to nearly every structure the canal still needed to build. And one white would spend years afterward trying, mostly without success, to collect proper payment for. He eventually sued one of the many private manufacturers who had used his patented process without licensing it, and the state legislature ultimately denied him a compensation award. It was a separate dispute that outlasted the canal's construction by years, and one that left the man whose cement had saved the project's hardest sections with little more than professional recognition to show for it. What mattered immediately in 1818 and 1819 was that the locks approaching the canal's hardest terrain would now be sealed with a domestic cement proven to work, rather than a material still being imported, tested, or hoped for. The middle section of the canal, meanwhile, continued to take shape without waiting for that question to be resolved. By 1819, significant stretches of the Utica to Syracuse route were complete enough that local boat traffic had already begun using finished portions of the channel, even as construction crews worked on the sections still ahead of them, an arrangement the canal commissioners had deliberately built into the project's financing. Rather than wait 8 years for a single grand opening, the state structured construction so that every completed segment could begin generating toll revenue immediately. This was not a minor administrative detail. It meant that the canal, still years from finished, was already proving its economic argument in miles, even as its harder, unbuilt sections remained a matter of open uncertainty. The first tolls collected on the finished middle section, beginning in 1820, were modest in absolute terms, but they carried a significance beyond their dollar value. Every merchant who paid to move a boatload of goods along 90 completed miles was providing the canal commissioners with real evidence, not projection, not argument, but measured revenue, that the $7 million bet the legislature had approved in 1817 was capable of paying for itself. That evidence mattered directly to the bondholders financing the remaining construction, and it mattered politically to Clinton, whose critics had spent 3 years predicting exactly the kind of expensive failure that early toll receipts were now failing to produce. Local business owners along the completed stretch noticed the change almost immediately. Goods that had previously required a slow, expensive wagon trip to reach any significant market could now move by water at a fraction of the cost, and the effect on prices in towns like Utica and the growing settlement around Syracuse was immediate enough that it became, in itself, an argument for finishing the rest of the route as quickly as the terrain would allow. The growth in traffic over the following years would confirm what the earliest tolls only suggested. Wheat shipments moving east along the canal totaled roughly 3,600 bushels in 1829, a figure that climbed to 500,000 bushels by 1837 and past 1 million bushels by 1841. A trajectory that tracked almost exactly with how much of the route had been completed and how far west the finished channel reached in a given year. Within 9 years of the canal's eventual completion, its accumulated tolls would exceed the entire $7 million cost of building it, repaying the bet the legislature had made in 1817 in less than a decade. Those harder sections were no longer a distant abstraction by 1819. Crews working westward from the completed middle portion were approaching 2 specific stretches of the route that the original surveys had flagged years earlier as the project's most serious remaining risks: a limestone escarpment near Lake Erie, steep enough that no wagon road had ever crossed it, and a marsh to the west of Syracuse that local residents had been warning canal workers about since before construction began. Wright and Geddes had built their reputations, such as they were, on 90 miles of comparatively forgiving terrain. The stump puller, the modified plow, the section-by-section contracting system, and the improvised trial-and-error approach to lock sealing had all been tested against farmland, forest, and gently sloped ground, obstacles that were difficult, expensive, and slow, but never at any point in serious doubt of eventually yielding to enough labor and enough time. What lay immediately ahead did not offer that same certainty. Canvas white cement, discovered by accident in a quarry near Chittenango, would prove essential to sealing the locks the escarpment required. Whether it would be enough, on its own, to get the canal through the two hardest stretches of its entire 363-mile route remained, as 1819 came to a close, still an open question. By 1820, the section of canal between Utica and the outskirts of Syracuse was substantially complete, and the commissioners could point to something the project's early critics had said would never exist: 90 miles of working, water-filled channel, carrying real boats and collecting real tolls. Construction crews moved on to the sections flanking it in both directions, east toward Albany and west toward Lake Erie, carrying with them a method that had for the most part worked. The eastern push reached its milestone first. On September 10, 1823, a 250-mile stretch of completed canal opened between Brockport and Albany, alongside the separate Champlain Canal connecting Lake Champlain to the Hudson. Combined with the earlier middle section, more than two-thirds of the entire Erie Canal route was now finished and generating revenue, a fact the canal commissioners publicized deliberately, since it answered, with working infrastructure rather than argument, the skepticism that had followed the project since Jesse Hawley's prison essays 16 years earlier. The celebrations that accompanied the September 1823 opening reflected how far the project's political standing had shifted since the Clintons' ditch mockery of its early years. Towns along the newly connected route held public gatherings to mark the occasion, and merchants who had spent years watching the canal advance mile by mile toward their communities could now, for the first time, load a boat directly bound for Albany and the Hudson River trade beyond it. The state's bondholders, who had committed capital to a project with no completed precedent to point to in 1817, now had 250 miles of working evidence that their investment was sound. What remained unfinished as 1823 became 1824 were the two stretches every survey since 1811 had identified as the hardest on the entire route. To the west lay the Niagara Escarpment, a cliff of solid limestone rising 60 feet within less than 2 miles of ground, blocking the canal's final approach to Lake Erie. Closer to the completed middle section lay Montezuma Marsh, a swamp at the northern end of Cayuga Lake that had already claimed a reputation among local residents long before a single canal worker arrived to dig through it. The marsh came first. Construction crews began digging through Montezuma in the spring of 1818, delayed nearly 3 weeks at the outset, simply waiting for seasonal floodwater to recede enough for work to begin at all. According to local accounts recorded by residents who watched the crews arrive, at least one member of the Cayuga Nation warned the workers directly against building through the swamp, describing a coming sickness in terms specific enough that later writers preserved the warning almost word for word: bad medicine, mosquitoes, men who would shake and burn and die. The warning was not acted on. and the reasons were structural rather than dismissive. The canal's surveyed route required a continuous channel connecting the completed middle section to the harder ground further west, and no alternative path around Montezuma Marsh existed that did not add significant distance and cost to a project already stretching state finances. The commissioners had committed to a specific line across the map in 1817, and the swamp sat directly on it. Digging through soft, waterlogged ground brought its own immediate difficulties before disease became the primary concern. Embankments the crews built to hold back marsh water repeatedly collapsed, requiring wooden planks to shore up the sides of the channel. Leeches attached themselves to workers standing in the wet trenches for hours at a time, and quicksand pockets scattered through the marsh made the footing itself unreliable in a way that flat farmland near Utica had never presented. Then, in the middle of July 1819, exactly as the earlier warning had described, the mosquitoes arrived in numbers the workers had not anticipated. Within a month, the majority of the workforce in the marsh section was suffering from what period accounts called Genesee fever, malaria, though the actual cause of the illness would not be scientifically identified for decades, and mosquitoes were not yet understood as a disease vector by anyone working the canal in 1819. The scale of the outbreak, as recorded in period accounts and local histories, was severe enough that it was said to have claimed more than 1,000 lives before the work stopped. Though the surviving contemporary record from 1819 itself is thinner than the later retellings suggest, and no mass burial sites from the period have been located near the marsh despite searches. What is not in dispute is that the mortality was serious enough to halt construction in the marsh entirely during the height of the outbreak, and serious enough that the eventual solution to the problem was not medical but seasonal. The uncertainty in the exact death toll says something specific about the conditions under which this section of the canal was built. Record keeping for a rotating, largely immigrant workforce, paid by contractors rather than directly by the state, was never as rigorous as the formal ledgers the canal commissioners kept for tolls and construction costs. Men who fell sick and died in a work camp on the edge of a swamp did not always generate the kind of paperwork that survives 2 centuries later, which is itself a form of evidence about whose lives the project's official record was built to track and whose it was not. Smallpox and other communicable illnesses moved through the crowded work camps alongside the malaria outbreak, spreading easily among men living and working in close proximity with limited sanitation. The combination of diseases, whatever their precise individual toll, was severe enough that some contractors abandoned their sections in the marsh entirely, unable to convince enough laborers to continue the work at any wage. Canal commissioners and contractors made the decision to work through Montezuma Marsh, primarily in winter, when the swamp froze over and the mosquito population that carried the fever became dormant. This solved the immediate crisis without anyone involved understanding why it worked. Nobody digging the Erie Canal in 1819 knew that mosquitoes transmitted malaria, since the parasite responsible for the disease would not be identified until 1880, more than half a century later. What the canal's workers and engineers understood from direct and costly experience was a seasonal pattern. Work stopped being fatal once the ground froze, and it became fatal again once it thawed. Winter construction carried its own severe cost, even without the fever. Frostbite was common among crews working through the coldest months, and the physical difficulty of excavating frozen, waterlogged ground with hand tools slowed progress considerably compared to the pace crews had maintained on the drier, more forgiving terrain near Utica. But slow, frost-bitten progress in winter was, by the calculation the contractors were forced to make, preferable to the mortality rate of a single summer month in the marsh. The section through Montezuma was eventually completed using this winter work pattern, joining the middle section to the rest of the route heading east, and demonstrating something about the project as a whole that would repeat itself at the canal's other major obstacles. A solution did not need to be scientifically correct to be operationally effective. The crews did not need to understand malaria to defeat it. They needed only to notice and act on the pattern of when it killed and when it did not. West of Montezuma, the route presented a different kind of obstacle entirely. Not disease, but a gap in the land itself. Near the small milling settlement of Rochesterville, the surveyed line had to cross the deep valley cut by Irondequoit Creek, a depression roughly 70 feet below the level the canal needed to maintain. And directly beyond it, the Genesee River, running through the middle of the same growing village. James Geddes had identified the Irondequoit crossing as a serious problem as early as his original 1808 survey, made on foot and horseback through snow deep enough that he was forced to estimate several of his elevation figures rather than measure them directly. What he found on a more precise second survey in 1816 was that a series of natural gravel ridges left behind by retreating glaciers ran partway across the valley, high ground that, if connected by an artificial earthwork, could carry the canal across without adding the roughly 150 feet of additional lockage that any other route through the valley would have required. The canal commissioners were reluctant to approve so bold a plan, but ultimately authorized it for the same reason they had authorized nearly every other unprecedented solution on the route. There was no realistic alternative. Crews built what came to be called the Great Embankment, an earthen berm 1,320 feet long and 76 feet high, carried on wheelbarrows, load by load, across the glacial ridges Geddes had identified, with Irondequoit Creek itself diverted to run beneath the finished structure through a stone culvert nearly 250 feet long. The contractor responsible for the embankment, an Irish canal builder named J.J. McShane, had bid the job at 25 cents per cubic yard of earth without ever having seen the site in person, and was reportedly relieved rather than disappointed when the state initially rejected his bid as too high. Once construction began, McShane discovered a complication the original survey had not fully accounted for. The soil beneath the embankment site was porous, and the banks of the creek itself were lined with quicksand, requiring roughly 900 log piles driven into the ground to stabilize a structure that was, at 76 feet, among the tallest man-made earthworks attempted in the United States to that point. Until the embankment was finished in October 1822, canal traffic through the area had to break at the gap entirely. Flour milled in Rochesterville was loaded onto boats, carried to the edge of the unfinished valley crossing, transferred onto wagons for an overland trip around the obstacle, and reloaded onto a different boat on the far side, a workaround that captured in miniature exactly the kind of inefficiency the entire canal had been built to eliminate. Beyond the Irondequoit crossing lay the Genesee River itself. Running directly through the settlement the canal was about to transform. Rather than dam the river and risk flooding the growing village, the canal commissioners approved construction of a stone aqueduct, a bridge carrying the canal's water and towpath across the river on a series of arches built of sandstone quarried from the Genesee Gorge a few miles upstream. Complete in September 1823 at a cost of $83,000, the finished structure ran 802 feet across the river on 9 arches and was, for a brief period, considered by visitors from well beyond New York State to be one of the more remarkable engineering sites in the country. The aqueduct's construction had not been without its own complications. Its original contractor, fresh off building the state's prison at Auburn, had imported convict laborers for the job, several of whom deserted the project before it was finished, and the sandstone itself proved less durable than the engineers had hoped. The first aqueduct began deteriorating within years of its completion and would eventually need to be replaced entirely by a sturdier limestone structure built nearly 2 decades later. For the milling settlement it now connected to the wider canal system, none of that later deterioration mattered in 1823. What mattered was that flour ground at Rochesterville's mills could now move directly onto a canal boat and travel, without a single overland transfer, all the way to New York Harbor. While the Irondequoit Crossing and the Genesee Aqueduct were solving the canal's most serious obstacle east of Buffalo, the escarpment near Lake Erie itself, the single hardest problem on the entire surveyed route, remained almost entirely untouched. The engineer assigned to this section was Nathan Roberts, a former schoolteacher whose background, consistent with nearly everyone the canal commissioners had hired to lead construction, included no formal engineering credential. What Roberts had was a demonstrated ability with mathematics and, by the early 1820s, several years of direct experience solving canal construction problems that had no textbook precedent to draw from, including, on an earlier section of the route, a refined version of the crude stump-pulling device the crews near Utica had first improvised, redesigned by Roberts into a version efficient enough that a single team of oxen could clear roughly 40 stumps in a day, 10 times what the earlier, cruder version had managed. That earlier reputation for practical, field-tested solutions was almost certainly why the commissioners trusted Roberts with the single hardest engineering problem the entire canal presented. There was no competitive process resembling a modern engineering bid. The commissioners were choosing, in effect, from a small pool of men who had already proven themselves capable of solving unprecedented problems on the sections they had already built, because no one else in the state had a longer track record to point to. The specific problem at the escarpment was one of elevation packed into an unusually short distance. The canal needed to rise 60 feet to reach the level of Lake Erie, but it needed to do so within roughly 2 miles of ground, a rate of change no single lock built anywhere on the canal so far could accommodate. The average lock elsewhere on the route managed a lift of somewhere between 10 and 15 feet, nowhere close to the 60 feet this stretch demanded. Roberts's solution, submitted to the commissioners and ultimately approved, was a flight of 5 combined locks, stacked directly against each other so that the upper gate of one lock formed the lower gate of the next, built as 2 parallel sets, one to raise westbound boats, one to lower eastbound boats, so that traffic in both directions could move through the escarpment without waiting for the opposing flow to clear first. Each individual lock measured 90 feet long by 15 feet wide and lifted a boat roughly 12 feet before passing it into the next chamber in the sequence. It was, structurally, an answer no one on the project had needed to invent before, because no other stretch of the route had presented a problem this compressed. The town that grew up around the construction site would eventually take its name directly from what Roberts had built there, Lockport, named for the staircase of locks that gave the settlement its reason to exist at all. Building the Flight of Five required more than laying out lock chambers on paper. Behind the locks, engineers needed a guaranteed water supply high enough in elevation to keep the upper level fed. And to get it, crews cut a channel through solid rock west of the locks, known afterward as the Deep Cut. A trench up to 50 feet deep, dug for nearly 3 miles almost entirely through limestone bedrock, using methods that had not existed anywhere in America before this project forced them into being. The engineering logic behind cutting so deep, rather than building additional locks to climb over the ridge instead of through it, came down to a resource the escarpment simply did not have enough of at higher elevation: water. A period account of the construction, later preserved in the canal's own records, explained the reasoning plainly. Locking up and over the ridge would have been cheaper and easier to build, but there was no reliable water supply at that greater height to keep additional lock chambers filled. The Deep Cut was, in that sense, not a display of engineering ambition for its own sake, but the only solution the local hydrology actually allowed. Roberts advertised in 1822 for 1,000 men to work at Lockport, offering $12 a month plus room and board, the same basic wage structure the canal's Irish laborers were being paid elsewhere along the route, doing work that was, if anything, more dangerous than what the Marsh crews had faced. The workforce at Lockport, an estimated 1,200 laborers at the project's peak in this section, was overwhelmingly composed of recently arrived Irish immigrants, the same population that had gradually taken over the hardest and least desirable sections of the canal as it moved further from the settled farmland near Utica. The excavation method itself relied on gunpowder. Dynamite would not be invented for another 5 decades, packed into hand-drilled holes across the rock face and detonated to fracture the limestone into pieces small enough to remove by hand and by horse-powered derrick. This process was, by any standard, extremely dangerous. Careless or inexperienced blasting caused deaths and severe injuries among the workforce, with a regularity that period accounts describe matter-of-factly as an accepted operating cost of a project moving as fast as the state's finances demanded. The men responsible for placing and lighting the blasting charges were disproportionately young, chosen deliberately for their ability to move quickly in and out of narrow rock fissures before a charge detonated. Later accounts of the work referred to them informally as powder monkeys, a term borrowed from naval gunnery crews, and their task carried a mortality risk distinct from and in some ways more immediate than the slow-moving fever that had struck the Marsh crews years earlier. An explosion killed or maimed in an instant, with no seasonal pattern anyone could work around. Removing the shattered rock, once a charge had been set off, required its own dedicated labor and equipment. Timber derricks, powered by horses walking in a circular treadmill pattern, lifted broken stone out of the cut and away from the workface, clearing space for the next round of drilling and blasting to begin. The entire cycle, drill, load, detonate, clear, repeat, moved forward at a pace measured in feet per week across nearly 3 miles of solid limestone, a rate of progress that made the Deep Cut, by a wide margin, the slowest and most expensive stretch of the canal to build per mile. Winter work at the Deep Cut developed its own improvised technique, distinct from anything used on the Marsh section. Crews drilled holes into the rock face and filled them with water, allowing the winter cold to freeze and expand the water inside the stone. cracking the rock along lines the crews could then exploit with less blasting powder than a fresh face of solid limestone would otherwise require. It was not a method anyone had brought from Europe, and it was not something Nathan Roberts or any other named engineer is recorded as having invented deliberately. It was, like the modified plow developed on the canal's easier eastern sections years earlier, a solution generated on-site by workers responding directly to the specific material in front of them, freezing water where blasting powder was too costly or too dangerous to use every time. The blasting at the deep cut and the surrounding rockwork was powerful enough that displaced fragments of stone were later found scattered as far as the town of Lockport itself, evidence of the sheer force involved in moving a canal through terrain that no wagon road in the region had ever successfully crossed. The combination of the deep cut and the flight of 5 locks would, when finished, stand as the single most technically demanding structure on the entire 363-mile route, and it would also be the last major piece of the canal to be completed, finished only weeks before the entire project reached its official completion date. By June 25, 1825, the original locks at Lockport were finished, closing the final significant gap in a route that had, over the preceding 8 years, been built in disconnected pieces by contractors, self-taught engineers, and a workforce that had shifted composition twice, first from local farmers to Irish immigrants as the terrain grew harder, and then into a workforce willing to handle gunpowder and rock blasting as the terrain grew harder still. What remained, once Lockport's locks were sealed and tested, was not construction, it was connection, joining a series of separately completed sections built years apart under different engineers and different local conditions into a single continuous waterway, 363 miles long, ready to carry a boat from the edge of one of the largest lakes in North America to the harbor of the largest city on the Atlantic coast. That boat, and the ceremony built around its journey, was already being planned before the last stone at Lockport had finished setting. The date chosen for the canal's official opening was October 26, 1825, and unlike the groundbreaking 8 years earlier, this ceremony was not built around a single symbolic shovelful of dirt. It was built around communication, around proving, in real time and across the entire length of New York State, that the canal had actually changed what was possible. By the time the canal reached completion, the question of federal support had been settled definitively, and not in New York's favor. In 1817, the same year construction began, Congress had passed the Bonus Act, a measure that would have directed federal funds toward internal improvements, including canal projects across several states. President James Madison vetoed it on his final day in office on constitutional grounds, and outgoing support for large federal infrastructure spending did not return under his successor. New York had built the entire canal, from its first survey to its final lock, without a dollar of federal money, a fact that would matter enormously to how the state, rather than the nation, ended up claiming the commercial rewards of what the canal made possible. The finished structure, joined together in October 1825, from sections built years apart by different contractors and different resident engineers, represented a total public investment of roughly $7,143,000, a figure that ran slightly over the original 1817 estimate, though not by a margin that troubled bondholders once the completed canal's toll revenue began arriving. Along its full length, the canal incorporated 83 locks and 18 aqueducts, rising a total of 568 feet between the level of the Hudson River and the level of Lake Erie, all of it accomplished by a workforce that, at its peak years, is estimated to have reached 50,000 laborers, local farmers, Irish and German immigrants, and British newcomers, working with shovels, picks, and horse-drawn scrapers on wages that, in the Canal Commission's own 1818 records, could run as low as roughly $1.88 for nearly 6 days of labor from a 3-man crew. Repayment of that $7 million debt did not rest on tolls alone. The legislature had also imposed a dedicated tax on salt production within the state, and had established a network of waylocks along the canal itself, stations where boats were measured and charged according to the actual weight of the cargo they carried, rather than a flat per-boat fee. Together, the salt tax and the waylock system gave the state 2 steady, verifiable revenue streams to set against the bond payments, independent of how quickly canal traffic itself grew in the earliest years, a hedge, in effect, against the possibility that Clinton's optimistic projections might prove overstated. At Buffalo, the celebration began the morning of the 26th with cannon fire at 9 o'clock. Marking the start of a procession toward the canal's western terminus. A band led the way, followed by soldiers and sailors, followed by the laborers who had done the actual digging over the preceding 8 years, carrying the spades and tools of their trade, followed by hundreds of ordinary citizens from the village of Buffalo and the surrounding settlements. At the end of the procession came a carriage carrying Governor DeWitt Clinton, alongside Senator Samuel Wilkerson, whose earlier work dredging Buffalo's harbor had been a necessary precondition for the entire ceremony. Without a usable harbor at the canal's western end, there would have been no functioning terminus for Buffalo to celebrate in the first place. Buffalo's position as that terminus had not been guaranteed. A neighboring village, Black Rock, situated on the Niagara River, had spent years competing directly with Buffalo for the designation, arguing that its location offered easier access to Lake Erie's shipping traffic. Buffalo's advantage came down to effort rather than natural geography alone. Local residents and merchants invested heavily in widening and deepening Buffalo Creek and constructing a proper harbor at its mouth, work that Wilkerson personally oversaw and which ultimately persuaded the canal commissioners to select Buffalo over its rival. Black Rock would eventually be annexed into a Buffalo grown large enough, decades later, to absorb the town it had once competed against for a canal terminus. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, Clinton boarded a boat named the Seneca Chief, carrying with him a ceremonial keg of water drawn directly from Lake Erie. A cannon fired as the boat departed Buffalo, and that single shot began a demonstration of communication technology that, in 1825, had no equal anywhere in the United States. Cannons had been positioned along the entire length of the canal and down the Hudson River, spaced closely enough that each artillery crew could hear the shot fired by the crew before it. As Clinton's cannon fired in Buffalo, the next cannon in the chain fired in response, and the one after that, and so on, in a continuous relay stretching across the full width of New York State and down to New York City. The system had no precedent as a method of long-distance communication in the United States, and it would remain, for close to 2 decades, the fastest way news of any kind had ever traveled across the length of the state. The telegraph, which would eventually replace this kind of relay entirely, would not reach practical, widespread use for another 2 decades, which meant that in October 1825, a chain of artillery crews, standing within earshot of one another, represented the state of the art in fast communication. repurposed for a single afternoon to announce that a canal was open. The message reached New York City in roughly 90 minutes, a distance of some 363 miles, communicated faster than any letter, rider, or ship could have carried the same information. Once the news reached the harbor, the cannons fired again in the opposite direction, relaying confirmation back to Buffalo that the message had arrived, completing a round trip of roughly 600 miles of sound in a matter of hours. While the cannon relay carried word of the canal's opening across the state in an afternoon, the Seneca chief itself moved at a considerably slower pace. Clinton's flotilla, which grew to include additional boats and dignitaries as it progressed, stopped at most of the towns along the canal's route, where local communities held their own celebrations to mark the boat's passage. A journey that turned what could have been a simple point-to-point voyage into a rolling, multi-day tour of the very towns the canal itself had helped bring into being. Many of the towns hosting these celebrations had not existed, or had existed only as small settlements before construction reached them years earlier. Communities like Rochester, Syracuse, and Lockport itself had grown directly out of canal construction activity, and their participation in the October 1825 flotilla celebrations was, in a very literal sense, a group of towns celebrating the infrastructure project that had created the conditions for their own existence. At each stop, local organizers had days to prepare, since the cannon relay had already told them precisely when the flotilla would arrive, giving towns along the route a rare advantage that no earlier traveler on the canal had ever enjoyed. Bands assembled, local militia companies turned out in whatever uniforms they owned, and merchants who had built their businesses around the canal's completed sections used the occasion to display goods that had, only a few years earlier, been impossible to obtain locally at any price. In some towns, the celebration doubled as a kind of unofficial inspection, with local officials eager to show visiting dignitaries how thoroughly their community had already been transformed by a project that, in the same towns, had once been the subject of open skepticism. The full trip from Buffalo to New York City took 9 days, considerably longer than the 8-day travel time the finished canal would typically offer once celebration stops were no longer part of the itinerary. Clinton and the flotilla reached New York Harbor on November 4th, 1825, where the ceremony that would give the entire event its lasting name took place. Standing at the front of his boat, Clinton took the keg of water he had carried from Lake Erie and emptied it into the Atlantic Ocean. Official accounts of the ceremony described the moment as a marriage of the waters, a deliberate, symbolic joining of the Great Lakes to the ocean, formalizing in public ritual what the canal had already accomplished in engineering, a continuous water connection between the interior of the continent and the harbors of the Atlantic trade. The ceremony did not end with a single gesture. Clinton and the officials accompanying him also emptied containers of water gathered from other major rivers and lakes along the route and, according to accounts of the day, from waterways well beyond it, a symbolic mingling meant to represent the entire expanding country joining in the occasion, not simply the state of New York marking its own accomplishment. The harbor itself was crowded with vessels and spectators for the occasion. An audience gathered to witness a piece of theater built around a claim that, 8 years earlier, most of the people now watching would have considered implausible. Newspaper accounts from the following days described the harbor celebration in terms that mixed civic pride with a measure of genuine astonishment, since many of the assembled crowd had lived through the entire 8 years of construction and skepticism, and few had expected to see the project completed within their own working lifetimes, let alone celebrated with a procession of boats stretching back toward the horizon. Fireworks followed the water ceremony into the evening, and for several days afterward, New York's own newspapers ran little else on their front pages besides accounts of the flotilla's progress, the speeches delivered at each stop, and estimates of the crowds that had gathered along the harbor to watch Clinton's boat arrive. The economic argument Clinton and his allies had been making since before construction began no longer required projection or promise. Freight that had cost roughly $100 a ton to move from Buffalo to New York City by wagon now cost somewhere between $6 and $10 a ton by canal boat, a reduction of roughly 90% achieved within the same calendar year the canal opened. A journey that had taken close to 3 weeks overland now took 8 to 10 days by water. The mechanics behind that price collapse were straightforward once the infrastructure existed. A single canal boat, pulled by a team of mules or horses walking a steady pace along the towpath, could carry roughly 30 tons of cargo, far more than any wagon team could manage over the same distance, and at a fraction of the labor and animal feed cost per ton actually moved. Water, unlike a rutted dirt road, did not degrade under the weight of what crossed it, and did not require the constant maintenance that overland routes demanded after every hard rain or spring thaw. The scale of that price change is difficult to overstate in terms of what it made newly possible rather than simply cheaper. At $100 a ton, shipping Western grain to Eastern markets had been, for most farmers, an option that erased most or all of the profit in the crop itself, worth attempting only for goods valuable enough per pound to absorb the cost, which grain generally was not. At $6 to $10 a ton, the same grain could be shipped profitably, which meant that land in central and western New York, and increasingly the Ohio territory beyond it, was suddenly worth farming for a market, rather than only for subsistence. The canal's own toll revenue confirmed the shift almost immediately. Within the first year of full operation, tolls collected along the route were already covering a meaningful share of the state's outstanding construction debt, and the trajectory of that revenue over the following years would eventually recoup the entire $7 million cost of building the canal in less than a decade, a bet the legislature had made in 1817 on uncertain projections, repaid in full with interest well within the lifetime of the officials who had approved it. Within its first few years of operation, the canal was carrying an estimated $15 million in commerce annually, a figure that period observers pointed out was roughly double the total trade volume moving down the Mississippi River in the same years. A striking comparison at the time, since the Mississippi represented the other major inland trade corridor available to American farmers and merchants, and it had a multi-state river system behind it, rather than a single artificial channel 40 feet wide. Passenger traffic followed a similar pattern of immediate, measurable demand. In its very first year of full operation, more than 40,000 passengers used the canal's packet boats, a form of travel that offered a combination of speed, comfort, and affordability that no overland stagecoach route in the region could match. The canal had been designed, financed, and built almost entirely around the logic of freight, grain, lumber, manufactured goods moving in both directions between the interior and the coast. But its human traffic proved, within months of opening, to be a substantial business in its own right. A small commercial economy grew up around that passenger traffic almost as quickly as the passenger traffic itself appeared. Vendors moved from boat to boat along the route, selling books, watches, and fruit to travelers with several idle days ahead of them, and less scrupulous operators followed the same routes, selling remedies of dubious value or passing counterfeit currency to passengers who had no easy way to verify what they were buying. Tourists traveling what became known as the Northern Tour used the canal as the first leg of a journey that increasingly ended at Niagara Falls, which the canal's existence had helped transform from a remote natural landmark into an accessible and increasingly popular destination. Not everyone who benefited from the canal's completion had been part of its original economic argument. Evangelical preachers used the new water route to expand their circuits across upstate New York, reaching congregations that had previously been difficult to travel between on a regular schedule. In later years, the same continuous water corridor would serve as one of the final legs of the Underground Railroad, carrying freedom seekers toward Buffalo and the Canadian border beyond it. A use for the canal that had nothing to do with tolls, grain, or the commercial calculations that had justified its $7 million cost to a skeptical state legislature in 1817. What the canal's opening did not immediately settle was the question of who exactly had been vindicated by its success. DeWitt Clinton, whose political career had been built and repeatedly threatened around this single project, stood at the center of the November ceremony as the official most closely identified with its outcome. The same man whose name had once been attached, mockingly, to an eponymous ditch that critics in his own state government had predicted would bankrupt New York without ever moving a single profitable ton of freight. Clinton's political fortunes had not tracked the canal's construction smoothly. He had been removed from his position on the Canal Commission itself in 1824, in a dispute driven largely by his political rivals rather than by any failure of the project, only to be swept back into office as governor later that same year on a wave of public reaction against what many New Yorkers saw as a petty attack on the man most responsible for a project now visibly, undeniably close to completion. By the time he stood at the front of the Seneca Chief in November 1825, Clinton's association with the canal had shifted from political liability to the foundation of his public legacy. Thomas Jefferson, who had called the entire project little short of madness in 1808, did not live to see the canal's completion in a state of having been proven wrong by name, though the contrast between his stated judgment and the canal's actual outcome would become, in the years that followed, one of the standard details historians attached to the story, a reminder that even a former president's confident assessment of what was and was not achievable had been built on the engineering knowledge available in 1808, not the knowledge that 8 years of forced improvisation would go on to produce. None of this, the ceremony, the cannon relay, the marriage of the waters, the immediate collapse in freight costs, was the canal's most consequential achievement. It was only the moment the achievement became undeniable to anyone who had doubted it. The actual transformation, the one that would reshape where Americans lived, how Western land was settled, and which city on the Atlantic coast would come to dominate the nation's commerce, was only beginning in the weeks after Clinton's ceremonial keg of lake water disappeared into the Atlantic. Buffalo, a village of roughly 2,400 people at the time of the celebration, and the string of smaller settlements strung along the canal's 363 miles were about to experience a rate of growth that had no real precedent anywhere else in the young country. Growth measured not in decades, but in years. Not every informed observer believed that growth would last. A geologist named Amos Eaton, who had co-founded Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy 2 years earlier, The very school that would soon begin producing the trained civil engineers, the Erie Canal itself, had been built entirely without. Toured the canal by boat in 1826 and recorded a blunt prediction about one of its fastest-growing towns, that the settlement was a mere mushroom springing up in a moment, destined to decay and fall away to nearly nothing within a few years. Within a decade, that same settlement would be one of the fastest-growing cities in the entire country, and Eaton's confident prediction would join Thomas Jefferson's earlier judgment about the canal itself as another example of expert certainty overtaken by what the canal actually produced. The canal's own designers had likewise underestimated what they had built. The original plan had assumed an annual freight volume of roughly 1.5 million tons moving through the finished channel, a figure the canal exceeded almost immediately after opening, straining locks and channel walls that had been engineered for a lighter and slower pace of traffic than merchants and farmers turned out to actually demand. Within less than a decade of the 1825 celebration, the same commissioners who had spent 8 years defending the canal's original design would be back before the legislature, this time asking for money to make it bigger. For the moment, though, in the days immediately following November 4th, 1825, none of that later strain had yet made itself felt. What existed, for the first time since Jesse Hawley had sketched out his 14 essays from a debtor's cell 18 years earlier, was a continuous, working waterway connecting the American interior to the Atlantic Ocean, a fact that no longer required argument, projection, or a former president's grudging reconsideration. It simply existed, and boats were already using it. Rochester offered the clearest single demonstration of what the canal's opening actually did to the towns sitting along its route, because Rochester's transformation happened faster and was measured more precisely than almost anywhere else on the line. In 1811, the 100-acre tract that would become the settlement had a population of exactly 15 people. The 3 men who had purchased the land, Nathaniel Rochester, Charles Carroll, and William Fitzhugh, along with their families and a handful of workers, drawn to the site by the same water power that had drawn earlier smaller mill operations to the falls of the Genesee River. By 1817, enough landowners had joined the settlement to organize it formally as the village of Rochesterville, with a population of 700. The canal reached the settlement in stages. The stretch connecting Rochester eastward opened in stages through 1822 and 1823, and the completion of the Genesee River Aqueduct in September 1823 gave the village, for the first time, an uninterrupted water route to Albany and, beyond it, the Hudson River trade. By that year, the population had grown to roughly 2,500 people, already a substantial increase from the 700 of 1817, but nothing compared to what followed once the canal reached its full, connected form in 1825. The scale of the immediate effect was recorded with unusual precision, because Rochester's millers had every reason to track exactly how much flour they were suddenly able to move. In the first 10 days after the canal opened its full connection to the Hudson, Rochester shipped roughly 40,000 barrels of flour, about 3,600 tons, eastward to Albany and New York City, a volume that would have been logistically impossible under the overland shipping costs and travel times that had defined the region only years earlier. Local mills, clustered along the falls in what became known as Brown's Race, were by this point processing roughly 25,000 bushels of wheat every day. Population followed milling capacity almost exactly. By 1830, Rochester's population had reached roughly 9,200 people, a figure that made it, at the time, the 25th largest city in the entire United States, an extraordinary ranking for a settlement that had counted 15 residents less than 2 decades earlier. The village was formally incorporated as a city in 1834, and by 1838, Rochester had become the largest flour-producing city in the United States, a title its mills held even as wheat cultivation itself gradually shifted further west, following the same canal-enabled logic of cheap transport that had built Rochester's mills in the first place. The nicknames the town accumulated across this period tracked its shifting identity, almost like a timeline of its own economic history. It was first called the Young Lion of the West, a name reflecting the sheer speed of its early growth. It became the Flour City once its milling output made it the nation's leader in that single commodity. And decades later, as the flour trade itself moved west with the wheat fields that fed it, Rochester became the Flour City instead, home to some of the country's largest nursery and horticultural businesses, a second economic identity made possible by the same cheap, fast transportation that had built the first one, repurposed for a different commodity once wheat no longer made economic sense to process locally. None of this growth happened in a social vacuum. The same canal that carried flour barrels east carried people, ideas, and institutions west and through the region in roughly equal measure, and Rochester in particular became a center for movements that had little to do with milling. Evangelical revivalist preaching, most notably a series of meetings led by Charles Grandison Finney in 1830 and 1831, found in canal-connected towns exactly the kind of mobile, growing population that revival movements depended on. Abolitionist organizing took root along the same corridor. Frederick Douglass would settle in Rochester in the following decade and publish his newspaper, the North Star, from the city, in what was by then one of the most economically connected towns in the country. Buffalo's growth followed a similar arc, though its starting conditions and its long-term trajectory differed from Rochester's in one important respect. Where Rochester's identity was built entirely on what the canal allowed it to process and ship, Buffalo's identity was built on its position as the canal's western terminus itself, the single point where the entire Great Lakes shipping system met the entire eastern seaboard trade network. At the time of the October 1825 opening celebration, the village of Buffalo held roughly 2,400 residents. Its path to that terminus designation had not been guaranteed. A competing settlement on the Niagara River, Black Rock, had spent years arguing for the same designation, and Buffalo secured it largely through the deliberate effort of local merchants and officials, including Samuel Wilkeson, who invested in widening and deepening Buffalo Creek and constructing a functional harbor where none had reliably existed before. That investment paid off in a form of growth measured in decades rather than centuries. Buffalo grew from its 1820 population of roughly 2,200 to more than 18,000 people by 1840, becoming, within the span of a single generation, the second largest city in the entire state of New York, trailing only New York City itself, a metropolis with more than 2 centuries of accumulated growth behind it. Black Rock, Buffalo's former rival for the canal terminus, was eventually annexed into the city it had once competed against, a small and literal illustration of how thoroughly one settlement's fortune could be redirected by a single infrastructure decision made years earlier. Buffalo's specific advantage, once the terminus decision was settled, was structural rather than purely commercial. Every ton of grain, lumber, or other Great Lakes cargo bound for the Erie Canal had to pass through Buffalo's harbor first, whether it originated in Ohio, Michigan, or further west, which made the city not simply a producer or processor of goods, the way Rochester was, but an unavoidable transfer point that captured a share of value from trade it had no direct hand in generating. Warehouses, grain elevators, and shipping agents multiplied along the waterfront through the 1830s specifically to manage this transfer function, an economic role built entirely on geography rather than on any single local industry. What happened to Buffalo and Rochester individually was, in aggregate, happening to the entire corridor the canal had opened. Towns that existed only as trading posts or mill sites before 1817, Utica, Syracuse, Lockport, and dozens of smaller settlements between them, grew into functioning small cities within the same narrow window of years, each one shaped by whatever local resource or geographic advantage the canal had suddenly made commercially viable. Even the smallest of these settlements felt the change in ways that had nothing to do with grand civic ambition. A village that had previously seen perhaps one wagon a week pass through on its way to somewhere else might now watch dozens of canal boats a day move past its docks, each one a potential customer for a tavern, a blacksmith, a general store, or a warehouse willing to hold goods for a merchant further down the line. Local economies that had operated for years on barter and small-scale local trade suddenly had access to a continuous flow of cash-paying travelers and shippers, and the general stores, inns, and stables that sprang up along the towpath in these smaller communities represented, in miniature, the same transformation playing out at far larger scale in Rochester and Buffalo. Syracuse's growth traced directly back to a resource that had been commercially marginal before the canal existed: the salt springs surrounding Onondaga Lake, which had been worked in a small way since the earliest years of European settlement in the region, but had never been economical to ship any real distance from the source. The canal changed that calculation immediately, and salt production became one of the state's own primary funding mechanisms for the canal's construction debt. The legislature had imposed a dedicated salt tax specifically because it recognized, even before construction finished, how directly the canal's completion would multiply the value of every barrel produced around Syracuse. Lockport's transformation was, in its own way, the most literal expression of how completely the canal could invent a city where none had existed before. The settlement had no meaningful population and no economic identity prior to Nathan Roberts's Flight of 5 Locks. Its entire reason for existing was the specific engineering problem the escarpment had presented. And once the locks were built, the same water power potential the deep cut had exposed while solving that problem became the foundation for a string of mills and factories that grew up around the lock complex through the following decades. A town that took its name, its layout, and its economic base directly from a single piece of infrastructure built to solve a problem that existed nowhere else on the route. The cumulative effect on New York City at the canal's eastern terminus was even more dramatic in absolute terms, because New York was competing not against neighboring villages, but against the other major port cities of the entire Atlantic seaboard. Before the canal opened, the competition for Western trade among East Coast ports was not a foregone conclusion in New York's favor. Flour inspection records from 1820 show Baltimore leading the nation's port cities with 577,000 barrels inspected, followed by Philadelphia at 400,000, with New York running a distant third at 267,000. a ranking that reflected Baltimore and Philadelphia's proximity to the Ohio River Valley trade routes that, at the time, still moved most efficiently overland or down the Mississippi rather than through New York at all. The specific reason New York eventually won this competition, when Baltimore and Philadelphia sat physically closer to the Ohio Valley trade, came down to the same fact that had made the entire canal possible in the first place. The mountain passage separating New York's interior from Lake Erie ran only about 600 feet above sea level at its highest point near Buffalo, a gap low enough that a horse-drawn canal boat could climb it in a manageable series of locks. No equivalent gap existed anywhere along Pennsylvania's or Maryland's more direct, geographically shorter routes toward the same interior markets, which meant that New York's roundabout, 363-mile detour through the Mohawk Valley was, in practical terms, faster and cheaper than either rival's shorter but mountain-blocked path. The canal reversed that ranking within years, and it did so before the full route was even complete. By 1823, with the canal only partially open, New York had already passed Philadelphia in flour volume, though Baltimore still led. By 1827, less than 2 years after the full canal opened, New York had taken the lead outright, inspecting 625,000 barrels against Baltimore's 572,000 and Philadelphia's 351,000. By 1860, New York's advantage in the flour trade alone had grown to several $1 million over both of its former rivals combined. The change in New York's own commercial infrastructure in the months immediately following the 1825 opening was fast enough to be documented almost day by day in the city's own newspapers. Gross business in the city increased by an estimated $6 million in the months after the canal's completion. 500 new commercial ventures were established in the first few months alone. A single April 1825 issue of the city's Gazette newspaper carried 1,115 new advertisements. That same year, entrepreneurs founded 12 new banks and 13 marine insurance companies, representing a combined investment of roughly $23 million, capital that had, in large part, been waiting for exactly the kind of guaranteed trade volume the canal now promised to deliver. Clerks, dock workers, warehouse managers, and cartmen found steady employment in numbers the city's waterfront had never previously required, and the neighborhoods clustered behind South Street and the lower Manhattan wharves grew dense with the daily business of receiving, storing, and reselling goods that had, only years earlier, arrived by an entirely different and far slower route. A merchant who had spent the 1810s waiting weeks for a single shipment of Western grain to clear an overland journey now found himself managing a schedule built around canal boats arriving on a predictable, near-daily basis, a shift in the basic rhythm of commerce that reshaped not just how much business the city did, but how quickly that business could actually move. Freight tonnage moving down the Hudson River into New York Harbor told the same story in a different unit of measurement. In 1824, the year before the canal's full opening, roughly 157,000 tons of goods moved down the Hudson into the harbor. 12 years later, that eastbound tonnage from the interior had very nearly quadrupled, a growth curve that tracked the canal's completed capacity almost exactly, since the volume of goods available to ship had been limited, for decades before 1825, not by demand in eastern markets, but by the physical impossibility of moving Western produce to those markets at a price that left any profit behind. By 1860, the cumulative effect of 35 years of this advantage had made New York the preeminent port, not just on the American coast, but among the largest port cities in the world. Only London and Liverpool handled a higher combined value and tonnage of trade. New York alone was moving roughly 2/3 of the nation's imports and 1/3 of its exports, handling more textile imports and grain exports than Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia combined. Three cities that, 4 decades earlier, had each held a stronger claim to national commercial leadership than New York itself. Watching this transformation unfold from the outside, the states and cities New York had outcompeted did not simply accept the new commercial order. They tried, with varying degrees of urgency and varying degrees of success, to build their own version of what New York had built. Pennsylvania's answer was the most ambitious and ultimately the most expensive failure among the major responses. In 1826, the state began construction on what became known as the Main Line of Public Works, a combined canal and railroad system intended to connect Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and, through Pittsburgh, to the Ohio River trade beyond it. The project ran directly into the same geographic obstacle that had made Pennsylvania's earlier canal proposals impractical in the first place: the Allegheny Mountains, a barrier steep enough that no simple canal route could cross it. Engineers were forced to design a portage railroad, a system that physically lifted entire canal boats out of the water and hauled them over the mountain range on rail cars before lowering them back into a canal channel on the far side, a workaround with no equivalent anywhere on the Erie Canal's route. The Pennsylvania system opened in 1834, 9 years after the Erie Canal, and it never achieved anything resembling the Erie's commercial success. It was offered for sale within a decade of opening, fell into declining use through the 1870s, and closed permanently in 1903, having never repaid the investors who had financed its construction. Pennsylvania's experience was not unique. New York's success touched off what later historians would come to call canal mania, a wave of imitative canal construction across states throughout the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic regions, nearly all of it financed through state-issued bonds rather than direct taxation, following the same financing model New York had used successfully in 1817. Most of these projects lacked the specific advantage that had made the Erie Canal possible in the first place: a natural, low-elevation gap through the mountains separating the interior from the coast. The geographic accident that had let New York build a canal requiring comparatively modest lockage across its entire 363-mile length. Without that advantage, canal after canal across the Midwest was built at enormous cost relative to the trade volume it ultimately carried. Indiana's Wabash and Erie Canal, Illinois' Illinois and Michigan Canal, and similar projects in half a dozen other states accumulated debts their toll revenues could never come close to servicing. When the Panic of 1837 struck the national economy, driven in significant part by a collapse in the speculative canal construction bond market that New York's own success had helped inflate, 8 separate states defaulted on their canal-related bonds during the Depression years that followed. A wave of state government failures that later commentators would describe as the country's first major infrastructure bubble, built almost entirely on the unrepeatable example of a single successful project cut through one specific gap in the Appalachian Mountains. New York, alone among the states that had gambled heavily on canal construction, had picked terrain that actually supported the bet. The $7 million the legislature had approved in 1817 over the objections of a sitting president and the mockery of the canal's own political rivals had been repaid in full through toll revenue within roughly a decade of the canal's completion. and by the time other states were defaulting on their own imitation projects in the early 1840s, the Erie Canal itself was already generating more annual toll revenue than the amount required to service its original construction debt, with surplus left over. Across the full span of its operating life as a toll-generating waterway, from 1825 through the early 1880s, the canal would collect an estimated $121 million in tolls, roughly 4 times what it had ever cost the state to build and operate. That surplus, and the trade volume generating it, would not go unchallenged forever. A new form of transportation was already being tested on short experimental lines in several states by the early 1830s, one that did not require water, did not freeze shut for 4 or 5 months every winter, and did not depend on finding a natural gap through a mountain range at all. Railroads could be built across terrain a canal could never cross, and unlike the Erie Canal, they could operate straight through the winter months, when the canal's own traffic stopped entirely and waited for the spring thaw the way it always had since 1825. New York's canal commissioners were not blind to what this new technology could eventually mean for a waterway that had, for a decade, held a trade advantage no competitor could match. What they could not yet know in the early 1830s was how gradually that competition would actually unfold, or how many more decades of near total dominance the canal still had left before a rail line finally reached all the way to Buffalo. The railroad that would eventually challenge the canal's dominance did not arrive as a single, sudden replacement. It arrived in pieces, over decades, in a pattern that mirrored the canal's own disconnected, section-by-section construction a generation earlier. The Mohawk and Hudson Railroad opened in 1837, offering a bypass around the canal's slowest stretch between Albany and Schenectady, a 14-mile shortcut over a route the canal itself was forced to take at a much slower pace because of the elevation change involved. Additional chartered lines gradually extended the route westward through the 1830s and early 1840s, each one built and financed independently, in a pattern that echoed the same disconnected, section-by-section approach the canal itself had used decades earlier, except that where the canal's sections had eventually joined into a single state-run system, these early railroads remained a patchwork of separate private companies for years before consolidation. By 1842, a continuous rail line ran the full distance to Buffalo, the same journey the Seneca chief had taken 9 days to complete in 1825, now available by a faster and, crucially, ice-free mode of transport that did not shut down for 4 or 5 months every winter the way the canal did. That single seasonal limitation, built into the canal's basic design from its first surveys in 1808, would prove to be one of the most persistent disadvantages the waterway could never fully engineer its way around, no matter how many times the channel itself was widened, deepened, or rebuilt in the decades that followed. Passenger traffic shifted to the railroad almost as soon as a continuous line existed, since travelers were willing to pay a premium for speed in a way that bulk freight shippers, moving grain and lumber that could tolerate a slower journey, generally were not. Freight told a different, longer story. As late as 1852, a full decade after continuous rail service reached Buffalo, the canal was still carrying roughly 13 times more freight tonnage than every railroad in New York State combined, a gap that reflected how much cheaper water transport remained for heavy, low-value bulk cargo, even against a faster competitor. The canal's own commissioners recognized, well before the railroads posed a serious threat to freight volume, that the original 40-foot wide, 4-foot deep channel Wright and Geddes had designed in 1817 would eventually become a constraint on its own success. An enlargement authorized in 1835 and completed in 1862 widened the canal to 70 feet and deepened it to 7 feet, allowing boats to carry up to 240 tons of cargo instead of the original 30, a fourfold increase in capacity per vessel, undertaken specifically to keep the canal's cost advantage over rail intact as railroad technology and rail freight capacity continued to improve. The enlargement project itself became, in its own way, a second act for some of the same engineering lineage the original construction had produced. Many of the men supervising the 1830s and 1840s enlargement work had trained, directly or indirectly, under Wright, Geddes, or their immediate successors on the original canal. A body of institutional knowledge about locks, aqueducts, and cement that had not existed anywhere in America in 1817, now mature enough to be applied to a second generation of construction on the very waterway that had first produced it. By this point, the canal had also become something else entirely, a fixture of daily life for tens of thousands of people who had never known the region without it. Children born along the towpath in the 1830s grew up watching packet boats and freight barges pass their homes the way earlier generations had watched wagon traffic on a country road, and an entire vocabulary of canal life, lock tenders, towpath drivers, boat cooks, and the mule teams that pulled everything along at a steady, unhurried walking pace, had become as ordinary a part of upstate New York's economy as farming itself. The advantage did not hold indefinitely. Railroad mileage across the state and the country expanded far faster than any single canal, however enlarged, could match. And by the final decades of the 19th century, the canal's toll revenue was no longer sufficient on its own to justify the tolls at all. In 1882, New York State voters approved a constitutional amendment ending tolls on the canal entirely, and beginning January 1st, 1883, boats moved through the Erie Canal free of charge, the same waterway that had been financed in 1817 on the explicit promise that toll revenue would repay its construction debt, now operated as a free public utility because tolls no longer meaningfully offset what railroads were capable of undercutting. Freed from the tolling requirement, but still losing ground to rail, the state made one more major attempt to keep the canal commercially relevant. Beginning in 1905 and completed in 1918, New York built an entirely new waterway, incorporating and enlarging sections of several natural rivers, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Oswego, the Genesee, and others, into what became known as the New York State Barge Canal. More than half of the original 1825 route was abandoned or destroyed in the process, replaced by a wider, deeper channel able to carry vessels up to 300 feet long, powered by their own engines rather than towed by mules and horses along a towpath that, by 1918, belonged entirely to a different era of transportation. The barge canal achieved a genuine, if temporary, commercial revival, driven primarily by a commodity the canal's original builders in 1817 could not have anticipated: petroleum products, which moved through the enlarged waterway in volumes that peaked around 1951, carried by self-propelled motorized vessels that had finally, nearly a century after Wright and Geddes first sketched the original channel, eliminated the mules and horses that had walked the towpath since the Seneca chief's first ceremonial voyage. That peak did not last. The completion of the New York State Thruway in 1956 offering a continuous highway route paralleling much of the old canal corridor, and the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959, allowing ocean-going ships to bypass the canal system entirely and sail directly from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes, together eliminated most of the remaining commercial argument for moving freight through a 19th century canal corridor at all. The same basic pattern that had made the original canal obsolete for passenger travel by the 1840s, a faster, more flexible competing technology arriving to claim the traffic a slower system could no longer defend, repeated itself a century later, this time claiming the freight traffic the canal had held onto through its first 100 years. By the final decades of the 20th century, commercial traffic on the New York State Canal system had declined to a small fraction of its historical volume, and the waterway's continued existence depended increasingly on a different kind of value entirely. In 1992, the system was placed under the New York State Thruway Authority and rebuilt in part around recreational boating and tourism rather than freight. In December 2000, Congress designated the full network, the Erie, Champlain, Oswego, and Cayuga-Seneca canals together, as the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor, formally recognizing more than 500 miles of navigable water, not as active commercial infrastructure, but as a preserved historical landscape. In 2016, the same system received designation as a National Historic Landmark. What survives along that corridor today is a physical record of every phase this account has traced. The original flight of 5 locks at Lockport, blasted through solid limestone by crews using hand-drilled holes and gunpowder in 1823 and 1825. Still stands largely intact, the single most complete surviving section of the original 1825 canal anywhere along its route, a structure now protected within the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor, visited by tourists who can, if they choose, push the same kind of wooden gate mechanism the lock tenders once operated by hand. The Genesee Aqueduct at Rochester, rebuilt in sturdier limestone in 1842 after the original sandstone structure began deteriorating within years of its 1823 completion, now carries automobile traffic across the river as the base of Rochester's Broad Street Bridge, a 19th century canal structure repurposed for a form of transportation the canal's builders could not have imagined, and later still repurposed again to carry the tracks of a short-lived subway system before returning finally to road traffic alone. The Great Embankment at Bushnell's Basin, the 76-foot earthwork McShane's crews built across the Irondequoit Valley, using nothing but wheelbarrows and log piles driven into quicksand, still carries the modern canal today, nearly 2 centuries after workers first found the porous, unstable ground beneath it, a structure that has, twice since its original construction, suffered breaches serious enough to flood the surrounding valley, evidence that the specific engineering risk McShane identified in 1822 never fully disappeared, only became better managed with guard gates and modern monitoring. Even the Syracuse Waylock, one of 7 stations built along the original canal specifically to measure a boat's cargo by weight rather than by a flat toll, the same system that had financed construction debt repayment alongside the state's dedicated salt tax, survives today as the Erie Canal Museum, the only one of the original waylocks still standing, now housing exhibits rather than measuring cargo. A visitor walking the towpath trail near any of these preserved sites today moves through the landscape at roughly the same pace a mule team once did, past locks that no longer raise commercial cargo and mile markers that once told a boat captain exactly how far remained to the next town. The physical experience of the canal, for anyone who chooses to walk or cycle its remaining towpath miles, has changed remarkably little from what a 19th century traveler would have known, even as everything the canal was originally built to accomplish has long since moved on to other forms of transportation entirely. In October 2025, communities along the entire corridor marked the 200th anniversary of the canal's original completion, with New York State's park system organizing commemorations that traced the same route Clinton's flotilla had taken in 1825. A bicentennial observance built around the recognition that whatever freight the canal no longer carries, the communities strung along its 363 miles still measure their own founding, their own early growth, and in some cases their own continued existence against a single infrastructure decision a state legislature made in April of 1817. None of these surviving structures, on their own, explain why the canal still matters to anyone who has never boated its recreational stretches or toured its historical sites. The canal's most significant and least visible legacy is not a structure at all. It is the shape of the American economy that grew up around the specific advantage the canal gave one city over every other city on the Atlantic coast. An advantage that compounded for decades after the physical need for the canal itself had largely disappeared. New York City's rise to national commercial dominance in the years immediately following 1825 was not, on its own, guaranteed to become permanent. Baltimore and Philadelphia had led the national flour trade as recently as 1820, and either city might plausibly have reclaimed commercial leadership once railroads made a canal's specific geographic advantages less decisive. A rail line, after all, could be built almost anywhere without needing a 600-foot gap in a mountain range to make the route feasible. That reclaiming never happened, in large part because the capital, banking infrastructure, and mercantile networks that New York built during the canal's years of uncontested advantage, the banks and marine insurance companies chartered in the canal's first year alone, the hundreds of new commercial ventures established in its first months of operation, did not disappear once railroads arrived. They simply found new cargo to finance and new routes to insure, having already accumulated the capital base and the institutional trust that took Baltimore and Philadelphia decades longer to rebuild, if they ever fully did. A bank does not need a canal running past its front door to keep operating once it has already become the bank that every merchant along the eastern seaboard trusts with financing a shipment. It only needed the canal once to become that bank in the first place. That accumulated advantage is, in a direct and traceable line, one of the reasons New York remains the financial center of the United States 200 years after a governor emptied a keg of lake water into the Atlantic Ocean. Wall Street's rise as the country's dominant banking and insurance district did not happen because of the Erie Canal alone, and no single cause explains a phenomenon that unfolded across 2 centuries of subsequent history. But the specific advantage New York secured between 1825 and the 1850s, the decades in which it definitively outpaced Baltimore and Philadelphia in trade volume, banking capital, and insurance underwriting, gave the city a head start in exactly the institutions that would later define American finance, a head start no competing city ever fully closed through a stock exchange, a shipping trade, and an insurance industry that all matured during the exact window when New York held an advantage no other Atlantic port could match. Baltimore and Philadelphia did not stop trying to close that gap once it became apparent, and their later efforts say something about how difficult a head start built on geography actually is to overcome once the advantage compounds into capital and institutional trust, rather than remaining a simple matter of shipping routes. Baltimore's own railroad investment in the following decades eventually gave it a faster connection to the western interior than New York's canal could match on pure travel time, and Philadelphia's banking sector remained substantial well into the 20th century. Neither city, however, managed to displace New York from the specific role the canal had given it first. The place merchants, shippers, and eventually financiers from every other part of the country default to trusting with their capital, simply because New York had been the place already trusted with it for a full generation before either rival could offer a serious alternative. The canal's story continues to surface in a smaller but recurring way whenever American policymakers debate the value of large-scale public infrastructure investment. It is regularly cited, in exactly this context, as one of the rare historical examples of a state government committing enormous, uncertain sums to a construction project with no guaranteed return, and having that bet pay off decisively enough to reshape the country's economic geography for 2 centuries afterward. A case study invoked by supporters of everything from high-speed rail proposals to broadband expansion projects, each argument built on the same basic shape: a government that spent heavily on unproven infrastructure, absorbed the risk that private capital would not, and generated returns that no single year's toll revenue or tax receipt could have predicted in advance. The canal's less cited counterpart, the wave of imitative canal projects across a dozen other states, most of which failed to repay their own construction debts and contributed to a national financial panic in 1837, is cited far less often, though it belongs in the same story, proof that New York's success was not a template so much as a single, unrepeatable convergence of geography, timing, and a willingness to keep improvising past every point where a formally trained engineer might have called the project impossible. Pennsylvania's main line of public works, forced to lift entire canal boats over the Allegheny Mountains on rail cars, because no water route through that terrain could ever have worked, stands as the clearest counterexample, proof that imitating New York's financing model without New York's specific geographic advantage produced, in state after state, the exact bankruptcy that New York's own critics had confidently predicted for the Erie Canal itself back in 1817. None of the men most responsible for that improvisation lived to see how permanently their work would reshape the country. DeWitt Clinton died in 1828, 3 years after the canal's completion, having spent less than a decade watching the project vindicate the confidence he had staked his entire political career on. A career that had survived removal from the Canal Commission itself in 1824, only to be rescued by public reaction against that removal in the same year the project was finally nearing completion. Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, the surveyors turned engineers who had never built a lock before 1817, went on to train the next generation of American civil engineers on other projects, simply because the Erie Canal remained, for years afterward, the only place in the country such training could be gained through direct experience. Wright in particular carried that reputation into consulting work on canal projects across several other states, effectively exporting the exact body of practical, self-taught knowledge that New York's own geography had forced into existence. Canvas White, whose accidental cement discovery near Chitango had sealed the canal's hardest locks, spent years afterward fighting, mostly without success, to be paid for a patent the state itself had encouraged manufacturers to ignore, and died in 1834, having received, by his own later account, little beyond professional recognition for a material that more than 500,000 bushels of the finished canal had depended on. Nathan Roberts, the school teacher who solved the Niagara Escarpment with a staircase of stone no one in America had needed to build before, went on to survey canal and railroad routes across half the country, and even conducted a federal survey of the Muscle Shoals on the Tennessee River, carrying with him a body of practical knowledge that no American engineering school could yet have taught when he first arrived at Lockport, with no formal qualification beyond a talent for mathematics. None of them set out, in July of 1817, to build the foundation of a global financial capital. They set out to move a boat from a lake to a river, across 363 miles of forest, rock, and swamp, using tools that had barely changed in a century, and a body of engineering knowledge that existed nowhere on paper before they generated it themselves. The water they moved is still moving today, in a canal that carries almost no freight, past locks that raise almost no commercial cargo, through towns that no longer depend on it for their survival. What it built does not need the water anymore. It only needed it once. This has been Quiet History at Bedtime. If you found value in this story, a subscribe, a like, or turning on notifications helps this channel keep telling the histories that go untold. Thank you for listening and for letting this play through to the end. Good night and sleep well.